Employers of Reddit, what's the most overqualified applicant to a position you've ever received? Story 1, I hired a man with a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in sociology, and a master's in anthropology with 20 years of teaching college experience as a janitor. I don't know why he doesn't teach anymore, but he was having a really hard time finding an entry-level job, and he really needs the insurance as he has a life-threatening illness that is being controlled with medication. Absolutely great employee and very interesting to converse with. It feels weird to be his supervisor, though, as I'm a high school dropout. Story 2, I worked HR at an amusement park. A guy came in who wanted to drive the little train that goes around the park, had been an arson and murder investigator for 30 years in a major U.S. city, and now just wanted to relax and drive a train. After much begging from us, he eventually agreed to become the new security manager, but only if we promised to let him drive the train on his days off. Story 3, when I was a manager at GameStop back in 2009-2010, I had a guy apply for a store associate position. He had a master's in marketing. In his interview, I asked him why he was applying for a job he was so overqualified for, and he said the marketing firm he worked at before closed down suddenly, and he needed something to keep the lights on while he searched for a better job. He got the position and was actually still there when I left GameStop. I recommended him to our regional manager as my replacement. Don't know if he got it or not, though, so I found a guy on Facebook. After I left, he worked at GameStop for about another 7 months before he finally found work in the marketing world again. He's been with that firm ever since, and he's doing great. He said he didn't get the manager position when I left, though. It was really nice to catch up with him. Story 4, a scientist, a physicist, I believe, with over 20 years of research at the University of Cambridge and his work history applied for a very basic administrative job. He was denied for having a lack of relevant work experience. He applied to replace me, BTW. I was leaving that job. I was 19 or so, and it was my job while I was at uni. Story 5, my coworkers interviewed a super overqualified guy for a shitty retail position at the bank I work at. He was an Eagle Scout, went to a prestigious college, top of his class, won a bunch of scholarships, and basically sold his entire childhood to volunteer work. His resume was impressive, but apparently he was just fed up with corporate politics at the very well-known company he had just quit. He was instead offered a job in one of the upper departments where I work. Story 6, I was hiring someone to do some basic data entry work. I was paying like 10 hours or something and was expecting to hire a student or something, had a guy submit everything, and he was mid-30s with over a decade of engineering experience on top of college. I couldn't fathom why he was applying for the job. He ended up storming off from the interview, so I suppose he was bitter about something. Story 7, my PhD dad lost his job when I was in middle school. He applied for a job at Wendy's and was told he was overqualified. It was a tough time for him and our family, but things eventually turned around for us. I'm proud of him for being willing to do whatever it took to take care of us. Story 8, I own a catering business restaurant bar. I had a lady applying for a waitress job last year. She worked for IRS, government. She was a top accountant, but made some small money laundering at her last workplace, so nobody wanted to hire her. I hired her anyway. Top employee for less money. Everybody deserves a second chance. Edit, I employed her as a financial consultant and stock manager, not as a waitress. Edit 2, she doesn't have access to any official documents or bills. His job is to discuss with us and give the board financial advice because she has a great experience in the field, and I want to use that. Also, every day, she makes the statistics and future food stock predictions for the upcoming week, estimated usage of food and drinks, stuff like that. Story 9, I was interviewing candidates for customer service positions in a call center. This woman was a Navy medic, trained in combat situations, had a couple of degrees. She was basically the last person I expected to see sitting across from me. I accepted her for the position, but she never accepted the job offer. I don't blame her. Story 10, I worked with a guy who was a former business executive, very intelligent guy, so I had some really interesting conversations. We both made 8 hours in a call center. I was trying to make extra cash in between IT jobs. He was just retired and bored sitting at home, a lone day living of his considerable assets. Still, one of the hardest working guys in the company. Story 11, eons ago, I was an office manager for a kitty litter plant. I did some hiring as part of that gig. A guy came to apply to work on the production line. He had a 3-page resume with a master's degree in numerous publications, extensive community involvement, etc. I flat out asked him why he wants to be slinging 30-pound boxes of kitty litter on the assembly line all day. He told me it was because a friend of his got into amazing shape very quickly, and he found out it was thanks to working at our plant. We were short, so I figured why stereotype, and told him he could start the next day. He lasted a grand total of 3 days on the production line. Story 12, I had 18 years experience working in a scratch bakery as a baker and full-time cake decorator. Also years of high-end restaurant experience as a side job. Quit the side job, and a few years later wanted a part-time job to save money to move to Hawaii. Taco Bell sent me an email saying I wasn't qualified among many other places. Pizza Hut is the only place that I could get to hire me as a driver. It was for the best. I loved working with those guys. Now I live in Hawaii. Story 13, not sure if this counts. But I was looking for a girl to date, and a grandmother kept hitting me up. I know she had like 3x as much experience as anyone else, but she wasn't the right fit for the positions I intended. Story 14, a CPA with about a dozen different accounting jobs applying for a minimum wage pick and pack job. I didn't want to hire him, but a coworker went over my head and hired him. Turned out he was a drunk, only lasted a few shifts before I fired him. Story 15, I hired a guy with several former CTO and VP of technology titles for an entry-level tech support position. The recession was not kind to him. He was the best hire I've made and killed it in that position, and others he moved up to in that company for the next several years. Story 16, I had someone apply for a risk analyst position who I believe had 3 masters and 1 PhD between math, chemistry, and physics. I knew something was going to be up, but wanted to bring them in and find out what, despite them having a meticulous resume, they couldn't speak a word of English. Very awkward time. Story 17, not an employer, but when I was a freshman in college, I worked in the dining hall with a line cook who had been a corporate financial manager at a large local corporation. His company had gone under and laid off almost everyone, and he was having a hard time finding a position. He was friends with the head of dining services and ended up working as a line cook. I'm pretty sure he got promoted very quickly to management, causing some bitter feelings among the other cooks. My understanding was that the company knew they'd have a management position open several months after he applied. So they asked him to work as a cook until the position opened. As a student worker, he was the nicest man I worked with, and an incredibly hard worker. I was glad when I came back the next academic year and found him as a manager, and I hope he's doing well now. Story 18, my dad has 7 college degrees, retired master sergeant, smartest and most well-adjusted guy I know. He works at a call center on a night shift. Asked why he doesn't find something that pays better, he says his work is too easy. He answers 3 to 7 calls a night and, I guess, watches movies and plays online poker the rest of the time. Story 19, I was manager of a small cafe, and people used to drop in resumes all the time. One day a woman who was in her early 60s came in with a resume. Usually I would thank people and put it aside until after service, but on that day, I happened to take a quick glance. Her last position said she had been a consultant specialist in emergency medicine. I then saw Doctors Without Borders and a further 30-ish years of a medical career. I sat down with her and asked her why she wanted the job. She said she had recently retired and was bored out of her skull. She was looking for a job that had the same energy requirements, but without the responsibility or shift length. She then said she had work for free, but I said if I gave her a job ID, have to pay her. She asked for $5 an hour, to which I said ID, have to pay her minimum wage. I put her on a trial, and she smashed it, so I offered her 3 days a week. She was easily the most organized and stress-free staff member I've ever employed. She worked for us for a bit under a year before deciding to go back into aid work. She also donated all her earnings from that job. Still one of my favorite people in the world. Story 20, former VP of a large bank in Canada applied at my gas station because, and I quote, they want me to support her and her boy. I have to give her half, but they didn't say half of what. I saw him a year later happily employed as a garbage man. He said his ex was furious and had to get a job. Story 21, when I went through basic training, there was a recruit who was in his mid-30s, Chinese fellow from a rural area. After talking to him, I learned that he had a master's in physics dealing with lasers or something like that. Enlisted to get his citizenship and give back to the country that welcomed him. Nice guy. Story 22, I have had a guy tell me when applying for a butcher's job, and I quote, I didn't think you understood what the job was, and that you may not want it, because you came in here dressed up for the job interview. Facepalm. Story 23, years ago while in college, I had an engineer apply at Wendy's, floored me. Then she explained that her and husband had just been transferred and she needed something until she got hired elsewhere, which made sense. Story 24, the janitor at my high school was a surgeon in Vietnam. He moved to America to get a better life for his son, but he couldn't speak English very well and took the job because it let his kid go to a private school basically for free. As soon as his kid graduated, he quit. Story 25, I am one of those overeducated people, as is my husband, and I also hire people. I have 3 BSc degrees and work in a small insurance agency. The girls I hired all have at least an MA, if not multiple BAs. It's an easy job, only pays about $40K a year, and a high school graduate could do it if they got the right licensure. I just got tired of politics, as did the other girl. My husband is a PhD and quit academia to work in the cafeteria of a certain popular bulk goods store. He's considered going to be a guard at a local prison. For some of us, happiness is far and away more important than money. Story 26, some guy who was a minister in the Egyptian government, no idea, who, unfortunately, it was a few years ago, and I'd only been there a few months, applied for a job at the company I work for GIS mapping. They had to reject him for lack of relevant experience, but the hiring manager wrote him a letter of commiseration in rejecting him. Feeling bad, she had to reject a minister. As to why he was applying, not a clue. Office gossip suspect. He was trying to secure a job overseas to get out. Maybe. Story 27, I didn't hire him, but there's a man working at my old high school with a master's in aerospace engineering and a couple other degrees. He worked for NASA and was one of the men who helped design the craft that put men on the moon. He's the guy who checks to see if you have been signed out before you leave campus. He's got an amazing sense of humor, and he has this air about him that just makes him fun to talk to. I spoke to him about his history a couple times. It's just weird to think that the guy keeping kids from sneaking off campus is a literal rocket scientist. Story 28, I used to work in a retail store as a student worker. Most of the employees were people who left school at 18 or even 16. Can't say anything bad about most of them, but TBH, they weren't the smartest bunch. Anyways, there was one guy with a PhD in chemistry. Although he enjoyed working there, it was the biggest waste of knowledge I've ever seen. Story 29, I'm kind of in this position right now. I have 16 years experience as a software design lead. In COBOL, there's almost zero demand for that near me, and I'm losing my job in a week. I have a few years of Java dev work, so I'm trying to make that transition, but it is difficult. Story 39, employer, but my husband is a trainer at Starbucks. Just last year, he had this guy who was in his 40s, clean cut, very, very respectful, super professional, all-around great dude. They got to talking, and my husband found out that he had a second job as a sports medicine consultant. And my husband asked how he got into that gig. The guy's a doctor, a literal, actual MD. He was an OBGYN back in Mexico. However, he'd have to return to medical school, only here in the US, before he could get a license to practice medicine here. So instead, this OBGYN with years of experience and a doctorate is serving up your lat and suggesting what stretches to do to loosen up those hamstrings. A doctor making coffee for a living drives me up a wall. What American dream. Story 31, I was a supervisor at a restaurant, and the hostess had her master's in hospitality tourism management. She never worked before, because she was always in school and had to start off somewhere. Story 32, I used to hang out at a small garage that worked on mostly dirt bikes for wheelers and sleds. A guy came in one day in a business suit asking about a job. He seemed friendly, talked for a bit. His only request was to have a separate work area and to kind of be left alone. The next day, the owner of the shop came out of his office with the guy's resume in hand and asked if it was a joke. Everyone told him it wasn't to their knowledge. Anyway, the guy went to MIT, had a ton of helicopter mechanic experience, and was last working for some aeronautics company. The owner of the shop called him and had him come in to talk. The guy's little brother had some terminal disease and wanted to be around more. He worked there for a couple years till his brother died, and he left. I left town right as the guy was hired, but my friends at the shop said he was magic with engines, but never really warmed up to anybody. A customer had brought his sled into the shop constantly for blown engines, new sled, third engine, and nobody knew what was causing it. Customer was pissed because he was only getting 1 or 2 rides per season, and the rest of the time it was in the shop. The overqualified guy comes out of his corner and looks down in the fuel tank and tells them to replace the fuel pickup hose. The fuel pickup line was cracked and sucked air when the fuel got under half tank because the engine to not get oil to lubricate two-stroke. Story 33 worked at Hot Topic as a store manager and had a guy come in and apply for a part-time associate position. He was the bassist of a very well-known emo band. I was like, why do you want to work here? He told me that he could already see the end was coming. Less attendance at the shows, the burnout of touring more and more, just to keep the same amount of ticket sales, album sales, to make the record label happy, etc. He was already predicting the death of the band and wanted to get ahead of it. So he wanted to work for us through the holiday season, get something on his resume, and apply to college. He ended up working at a store closer to his parents' house and went to college. I have no idea where he went after that. But I know about 2 years later, we stopped carrying their shirts and merch. He was right. The band didn't make it. And no, I want to name the band. People deserve to live private lives, even if they were famous for a few years. Story 34, non-employer, but my older sister has a PhD in some medical field. I've read her book, which is on TB. Quite amazing. Anyhow, she has seriously struggled to get a job and had to start taking her PhD off of her CV as everyone kept saying she was overqualified. She's a teaching assistant, and when her colleagues somehow found out she has a PhD, their jaws dropped. I myself dropped out of uni. Story 35, had a guy come to work at my company where we sell houses. I asked him what he used to do, and he said he was in sales. I asked him what kind of sales. He said he was in restaurant sales and had done $2 million the year before. I said, wow, dude, you were in restaurant sales. What does that mean? Were you on the wholesale side? He said, no, front of house. I asked him to clarify, and after a few minutes of him explaining, I realized that he was a server at a restaurant. So he wasn't technically overqualified unless you asked him. Story 36, I applied to work 3 months as a janitor after finishing my master's in English, cleaned up a schizophrenic patient's vomit, and made him not feel bad about it. His mom just brought him McDonald's. I've been there literally, same psych ward, same age, teenager, just broke, schizophrenia, hit 17 to 22. I was glad to do it. His first taste of outside after losing it. Ate too fast, med side effects. Made me proud to help. I also encouraged the doctors, telling them how much their counterparts helped me years earlier, 18, 19, first 2 years of college, 19 to 20 breakdown, 21 to 26 graduation with masters, 43 now, only had one other breakdown, medications help a lot. Story 37, my friend has a master's and almost didn't get her hostess job for being overqualified. They figured she'd get a job in her field and leave. Almost a year later, she's still there. Either her field isn't hiring or she can't break into it for whatever reason. Story 38, I wasn't the employer, but an employee, and I had a coworker that you could say was overqualified. The manager and owner running this restaurant really had no idea what they were doing, as the owner had purchased a restaurant as a hobby, and the manager was promoted prematurely due to a string of managers walking out due to the owner's inexperience. At one point, we had 4 total employees in a restaurant that required 9 or 10 total to run smoothly, so the manager and owner were quite desperate to hire people. During that period, they literally had people coming in off the streets to work for one night, so they could buy some extra time to hire a permanent employee. They had posted some ad on a job site that said 15-hour serving position was available, which was very easily misinterpreted at 15+ tips. We had a guy come in for an interview in his 30s, a very professional-looking dude applying for an entry-level serving position, looking for some extra income as he was trying to start his family. Our boss, for some reason, never talked about wages in the interview, so it went completely under the radar for this guy. This new guy came to his first day of work ready to make bank, and within 5 minutes we got talking, and he said something like, if it's a busy night and I make a lot of tips, I'll be making more per hour here than I do at my aerospace engineering job. And then I just told him he must be mistaken because we were making $4.95 hour and the restaurant was never busy enough to break 10 hour. The guy took off his name tag and walked out. We never saw him again. Story 39, an old professor of mine, a little less than a year after I graduated university, I went back there recruiting for a summer internship at the company I work for. My professor came by looking for a summer internship, dropped off his resume and CV full of publications and articles and grant work, a doctorate and 2 masters, for a job where basically the only requirement was understand the concepts he taught in his intro-level course. To be fair, he was upfront about the reason he wanted the job, and it was pretty reasonable. He just wanted to keep up with what's going on in the industry. Story 40, I have a bachelor's degree in teaching, but I applied and was hired at a grocery store as a bagger. When they asked me why I was applying, I explained that it makes more sense for me as a new mom to have a night job, spend time with my baby, and not pay for daycare. Unfortunately, there's not a great variety of jobs when you want to work nights or weekends. Story 41, I was an overqualified applicant that was given a low-level position. I was unemployed for quite some time, and despite being a college grad, I was having a hard time finding a job. I needed a job, and I was willing to start off in a low-level position because it'd be a good way to get my foot in the door, and I knew I could show that I was capable worthy of a better position. I applied to this place to work as a retail restocker, and despite being paid a fairly low wage, I figured the amount of hours I'd have to work would balance things out. At the interview, my then soon-to-be supervisor more or less let me know that he was impressed with my resume, and he knew that I was really overqualified for that position. But he said he liked my enthusiasm, willingness to work, and would give me the opportunity to be able to outgrow that position. Quite some time later, he told me that he made that decision because he knew I'd eventually become a useful asset to the store. He simply wanted me to prove myself. In the end, things didn't work out, and I quit 11 months into that job. My supervisors knew what I was capable of, and I was regularly given more responsibilities, but my paycheck didn't reflect my workload. Story 42, not a manager, but I got to rifle through the resumes at my old job as a receptionist for my replacement. It was a small family-owned business anyway. I remember one applicant listed all the firearms he was trained at, including machine guns. This is actually strange because guns are illegal in Australia. I assume he was an ex-Army guy and needed to submit his resume to X number of places in order to keep getting benefits. Why else would anyone think that a list of guns one is proficient in and nothing else is relevant to a reception position? Story 43: Brevity, Clarity, and Well-Matching Experiences. I know a person who has raised $1 billion for charity, and his resume is 1 page. That's all you need. Edit yes. I realize that in certain positions more than 1 page is expected, academia being one. Story 44: Not an employer, but I went to a not well-known university in New Jersey, and my law professor was an absolute genius. He graduated from NYU and wrote 3 books. He essentially knew the answer to any question anybody ever had. Some students didn't like him because he actually challenged his students, and the class wasn't a cakewalk. I love the class, though, and was wondering why this guy is teaching at some crappy school in NJ nobody cares about. Story 45: This will get buried. But until recently, I ran a retail store in one of the largest mining towns in Australia. We would routinely get applications for a casual 5-hour PW position from people with master's degrees in engineering, geology, etc. because they came out here thinking that would guarantee them a job in the mines. When the reality is without any experience, it's quite hard to get into, and most have to start at the bottom entry-level unskilled positions first in order to get the experience to even get a foot in the door. Story 46: I work with a guy who was a former Marine Scout sniper with 14 years active duty and a bachelor's degree in business. We are both apprentices to a mason in my city. He's a really interesting guy, but I was really confused his decision to try to become a mason. He told me learning the trade is interesting to him because his grandfather was, and it helps him overcome some of his PTSD. He's this really nice guy and an amazing worker. Story 47: I work in the IT help desk in my uni, and last year, Vince's name change applied to the job fair. He had around 6 years working for the military on IT stuff, not sure what the title was, but it was fancy. Amongst the team leaders, we decided that he definite could have replaced our director of IT. It was a fun time working with that dude. He quit this year because he had another better paying job. Wherever you are, you did good. Story 48: A few years ago, I was a security guard making like $12 an hour. It was good money for me at the time, but nothing to brag about, obviously. I worked with an older black gentleman named Bernard. He was awesome. He had multiple master's degrees, was an uber-successful real estate investor with millions saved, and he basically won the game of life. Only reason he came out of retirement and decided to work as a security guard was because his wife passed and he was bored sitting around. He would have done it for free. He was amazing. Story 49: Not an employer, but I was on a job site last week where there was a floor layer from Iran who was a doctor before he emigrated. His wife is a cashier at a grocery store, and she was a nuclear engineer. Beats being dead, I guess. Story 50: I own a small company, less than 100, but more than 50 employees producing and selling stuff. In 2015, a refugee applied for a job. He only had basic knowledge of language and questionable education, but he seemed so motivated and genuinely interested in what we were doing that I decided I had to give him a chance. He mostly did small stuff like stock taking, digitizing inventory, janitor work, etc. After about a month, he asked me if we could give his friend a job. I was hesitant at first because he had turned out to be a good employee, but there aren't that many tasks for untrained people. However, I told him he should bring him with him the next day. The next morning, I sit down and had a coffee with both of them, so I could see what his friend was up to. It turned out his friend was a petroleum engineer that spoke English very well. I employed him so he could visit a German language course at my expense, and then I got him a job at a local refinery that is owned by a business friend. Other than that, I have employed a number of people that probably are too good for the job they are doing. But there's one where I know it for sure, my secretary personal assistant. She was my first employee, and she is absolutely indispensable. If she ever left, I'd probably have to hire at least 2 managers and a secretary to replace her. She really grew into it. She knows my personal agenda and my company's agenda out of her head, knows every business partner and his family and their birthdays, anniversaries, all my employees' birthdays, anniversaries, keeps track of our contracts. She even knows a lot about accounting and tax duty. As long as I have her, all I have to do is getting purchase orders for my business and remember her birthday. And she's so humble. She always says that being my secretary is all she likes to do because it never gets boring and that she doesn't need a fancy title since everyone knows she's the boss anyways. And the latter one is true. Over the years, I raised her salary numerous times. Nowadays, it is equal to that of my best qualified academic employees, my head of legal department, my accountant, my production engineer, but she's the only one that gets a profit sharing. So she actually is my highest paid employee and the only person I ever gifted a car to. Story 51: Interviewed a lot of people who are masters or PhDs in stats, data analytics, etc. for entry-level jobs. I work in that field, and I see all the time highly qualified people on paper that cannot understand or comprehend the softer side of working in a business environment, where they spend so much time working on their masters, PhDs, that they're obsolete business-wise by the time they really are in the corporate side and have to resort to either staying on the academic side or start from scratch in the corporate world. In terms of specific example, I had many PhDs in consumer behavior, psych, etc., coming in for 40K entry jobs in related fields because they have zero experience in client-facing, deck building, or industry norms. The best was a published author of a study that I referenced in a pitch not too long ago. I was like, wait a minute, I know your name. Story 52 hired a lady with a master's in education as a preschool teacher. She was from Bulgaria and needed some experience on her resume, I guess. She had been an assistant principal at her last job. So who knows? She was an excellent teacher. I think she runs her own Bulgarian school full-time now and does community outreach. Story 53, I have a master's degree in sports management and am a joke and sketch screenplay writer. Most people don't even know that you can get a master's in sports management, and whenever I've interviewed for regular business management jobs, I've gotten weird looks. Story 54, I have a cousin who works in aerospace design. He would go through phases of contract hopping. Basically, you shop your resume around to all the major technical contracting firms like Aerotech, and eventually one picks you up and throws you onto a contract position for as long as the position stays open. He ended up jumping around the country for a few years, but as a single guy with no kids, he was fine with that. Anyways, when he was between contracts, depending on the state and the labor rules, he would often go on state unemployment benefits to hold him over until the next contracting house had a spot for him. Usually, a condition of these benefits is to provide proof that he was seeking a job. Usually some number of interviews per week was required, so he'd go sit in interviews for positions he was vastly overqualified for, just so he could check the box and keep the benefits until the next contract arose. I'm sure he got plenty of funny looks from managers in retail and fast food for being a guy with a master's in aerospace engineering and 10 years experience interviewing for a cashier position. Story 55, if I remember correctly. This is going a while back. I remember a woman in her mid-50s, super quiet, was applying for a part-time teaching role, her past job building guided rockets. Story 56 used to work as a field operations manager for a security company, which entailed hiring people. When I was leaving the company, I had to find a replacement and had a lot of viable candidates, many far more qualified for the position than I ever was. One gentleman had 2 master's degrees in business management and 20 years in the military and different operations management. He was extremely overqualified for the position, and he would have absolutely killed it. So what happened? My boss recognized right away that if hired, the applicant would certainly find his way working towards my boss job and my boss job, and thus my boss didn't allow me to hire him. Ended up hiring some other guy that only lasted about 6 months and quit. I've heard they've gone through another 2 or 3 in the past couple of years. Not surprised. It was a terrible position to work, hence why I left too. Story 57. This is depressing, but also good to read. I've been looking for a job for over a year, and am having the hardest time finding something. Apparently my experience needs experience. Story 58. I never met the guy, but at the company I currently work for, there used to be a guy working there that had his PhD in biochemical engineering or some such thing. He quit all of that life to be a skydiver and worked as a tandem instructor in rigger. He now designs and builds parachutes and wingsuits. So he eventually stepped back up to something approaching his level, I suppose. Story 59, I had a guy with a PhD in CFA who was a CTO when he apply for a job as a business analyst on my team. Because his company was going under, a good manager doesn't hesitate to hire a qualified candidate. But no good manager hires someone that's only looking for any job until they find something better. Story 60, my mom had a bachelor's degree in biology and an MBA along with lots of working experience using mostly the former degree. When we moved to America, we were only planning on staying for a year or 2, and my mom didn't feel comfortable not disclosing that to potential employers. No surprise she didn't have any success in her fields. So she ended up applying to the CVS a few steps from our house in the cosmetics department. She got hired, and after a while had won a regional marketing contest, and they were begging her to go to management training, telling her she could quickly become a store manager. She wasn't persuaded and left to get a PhD when it became clear we were staying a little longer. Story 61, this will get buried, but my grandfather applied for a job at Radio Shack after he retired from Seagate after working there for 35 years as one of their senior engineers. He has a bachelor's and master's in electrical engineering and a bachelor's in business. He would have worked for minimum wage no problem. He couldn't stand retirement. He needed somewhere to be every day, and electronics were his thing. He was turned down for a job there because he was overqualified. Instead, he drove a school bus to his local school district for many years. Story 62, nuclear physicists specialized in NERV engines, electric ion thrusters, applied for role of building site manager. Not just a rocket scientist, but a nuclear rocket scientist. We hired him. He was really good. I wrote him a reference letter for his new employers at NASA, which was a lot of fun to write. Story 63, I was hiring what we called a consultant to help people install SW. Apparently, we got something wrong with the wording in the ad. The HR manager did not have the heart to tell the applicant he had flown nearly 200 miles for the wrong interview. So he introduced the gentleman to me, the hiring manager, to do the dirty deed. The guy was dressed in clothes that probably equally my yearly salary, with a cashmere overcoat draped over his shoulders. West Wing material. His resume said his last job was as a personal consultant to the Prime Minister of Canada. The interview was short, and I apologized profusely.